Hi, my name is Ryan, and diving right in, we're going to be taking a look at the poem The Bees by Audre Lorde. In this poem, we observe the impulsive nature of young boys, how they decide to act on impulse without prior consideration of the consequences of their actions, both moral and physical, and deliberately destroy a beehive. The poem starts with the throwing of stones at a swarm of bees. At this point of the poetic ensemble, it isn't really disclosed whether or not the bees were swarming at the children or if they were merely gathering back into their hive. It's later revealed that the bees were not attacking, but returning to the hive. We see for the first time how the adolescent mind behaves. It acts impulsively and sometimes without remorse. Because the bees feel threatened, they begin to mount a slow retaliation against the boys. The tipping point of the children's aggression, though, stems from one of the boys being stung. And most would consider this, an adequate response to the bees being put in a dangerous situation themselves. But not the boys, and certainly not the adult supervisors who are quick to intervene. But unaware that the bees were provoked by the children, all the adults in the situation know is that the boy was stung, and that the bees were the perpetrators. But the adults that take action take it pretty violently. They use wooden brooms, destroying the hive bit by bit. And as the hive comes crashing down, the boy, assuming specifically it's the one that was stung, starts smashing the hive with his feet. But four little girls who witness this interaction and speak out saying, "Hey, the bees weren't making any trouble, and we could have studied honey making." This implies that the girls were aware of their actions and the order that they transpired in. The keynote, which is what makes this poem so fascinating, is that they, meaning the girls, understood that all that had happened was unnecessary and harmful. The moral implication of false information can lead to catastrophic consequences. So today in this analyzation, we're just going to be taking a look at what are the primary differences between, the adolescent mind of a young boy and a young girl, and really, how that changes throughout the course of their adulthood. So when we take a look at, I'm going to use a specific developmental model of critical thinking by Deanna Kuhn. And basically, her explanation of early childhood is that, in early childhood, we think largely and concretely, we tie to tangible experiences. So children in this stage, typically, they rely on sensory information and direct experience. So that basically just means that they learn through interaction with their environment. They heavily rely on, what they can see, touch, hear, taste, and smell. So, that's the reliance on sensory information and direct experience. Also in this stage, we see that they accept authority, specifically from, older individuals such as, parents, teachers, etc. So we see when they accept authority, young children, often accept explanations from adults without skepticism, showing early trust in external authority over personal reasoning. So at this point in their life, they don't really have a sense of, self-awareness and the ability to reason in their own mind. They typically take exterior knowledge and apply that to, what interactions they exist in on an everyday basis. But at the same time, we also see them beginning to use basic, simple logic. And so what I mean by that is that, they start to apply basic cause and effect reasoning, but within a very limited scope. And we see that how limited that scope is, specifically when we talk about the boys in this situation, the boys in this poem. So although, it's within a very limited scope, it's tied closely to their direct experiences, right? But the impulsivity or lack thereof, when we talk about the boys, it's due to a nature of exploration and curiosity, but at the same time, in the girls' perspective, even at that young age, even though they're all the same age, the girl's brain is wired somewhat differently. And so we'll take a look into that a little bit later. But, the implications for this, at this stage of their lives is that learning environments should be rich in sensory experiences and hands-on activities. But you know, not ones that can place children of this age in specific danger. But, we're encouraging curiosity and providing experiences for exploration, but that will lay the groundwork for later critical thinking skills. But as we move on to middle childhood, we kind of see a slight shift. So, they develop basic understanding of the concept of perspective, which is quite vital in middle childhood, because you're exposed to more situations that could pose a threat to yourself and, others around you. So during middle childhood, that's typically, at least in my personal experience growing up, is when I've seen children begin to cuss and begin to explore themselves. And that can be physical exploration, mental exploration, but all in all, this level of childhood kind of puts the child more at risk because they're detaching somewhat from their parents and trying to figure out who they are as their own person. And so that can lead to many negative things such as drug abuse, skipping class, lying to your parents, etc. But that's where, the idea of basic perspective coming into play more often is what ends up happening. So they understand and they start recognizing different perspectives. So children, they realize that other people can have different thoughts, beliefs, feelings from their own. Their state of thinking becomes a little less isolated and, a little bit more expansive. So they also, have more concrete operational thinking. And, according to, and this is straight from the study, Piaget's stages of cognitive development, children in this phase can perform operations on concrete objects but struggle with abstract thinking. So they're not quite there in terms of thinking somewhat outside the box, but still focused on what they can see, touch, feel, all the sensory information that they're tied to in their early childhood. And they also, in this stage, have, the beginnings of reflective judgment. So they start to question the information that they're being fed by, adults in general, and basically any member of authority. So they start to question that. And so they may compare it to the views with their peers, with themselves, etc. Though this is often still within a concrete and personal frame of reference, like I mentioned. And so as we shift into adolescence, we see even more change, right? So there's a significant, jump from where they are in their cognitive abilities in middle childhood compared to adolescence. So, that includes the capacity for abstract thinking and, they develop somewhat of more of a personal identity. But the key developments that we recognize are, abstract and hypothetical thinking. That is quite literally the biggest one, I would say. Adolescents can, finally think more about concepts, ideas, situations that, aren't directly tied to their concrete experiences, but they're more developed in the abstract. This includes thinking about hypothetical situations and future possibilities of, and this is all ties into kind of how we view dangerous situations and critical thinking. And so more into critical thinking, they develop more of a critical sense of an examination of authority. This is when, we really see in development where a child can go astray or just be able to critically, not undermine authority, but critically evaluate it. So there's a growing skepticism of information received from authorities as adolescents. And, we begin to establish our own values and beliefs. There's also, and I feel like this is very stereotypical of teenagers in general, but the engagement in argumentation. So this is when we see children usually talking back to their parents, fighting with their parents, saying like, oh, this is my life, and you don't know what's best for me, I know what's best for me. They pretty much just get into their own head about things, and in their heads they're like, oh, I know what's right, I can finally think for myself, and I'm really, really questioning the authority figures around me and, the information that I'm being told from them. And at the end of the day, I know what's best. So as we move into adulthood, this is where we finally see everything kind of come together And that's when we're, going to be taking a step back from this model and, applying this information directly into what we've seen in this poem. But in adulthood, we see that critical thinking becomes much more sophisticated and nuanced. So as adults, we have a huge sense of systematic and reflective reasoning. So that pretty much just means having the ability to engage in deep, reflective thought about complex stuff that, considering multiple perspectives and the nuances of arguments, it's quite essential. And so we're also aware of biases, that we finally understand that people have their own biases and limitations of their knowledge, but we strive for a more balanced and objective approach to evaluating information. And so we recognize that although people can have different perspectives, we as a collective are able to figure out where their biases can intertwine with that and kind of weed out what we know is bias and what we know is factual information. And so we also see the commitment to evidence is where, can sometimes disprove biases. We understand that the importance of evidence in supporting arguments, and we're adept to kind of seeking out and, evaluating evidence into, our reasoning process, which is quite important, because without so we would be making the same mistakes and putting ourselves in situations like we see in the poem, as we did in childhood, and it's very bad if we were to do that. So that's, the developmental model as laid out. And so I'm just going to summarize Kuhn's perspective a little bit. Her model pretty much just underscores the evolutionary nature of critical thinking, and it highlights the role of education, experience, and etc. So by tailoring teaching strategies and curricula to cognitive abilities of learning at different stages, educators can more effectively cultivate critical thinking skills that are essential for personal and professional success. And so, yeah. So I've actually brought someone else into this podcast just to gain some experience from, a different perspective. So this is Hannah.
Hi.
Hi, Hannah. So Hannah is a girl. And so basically because I can't really speak from my own perspective because I'm a boy, and then I grew up with, the typical standard boy impulse control issues. And I'm assuming it was probably a little bit different for you. So can you just tell me a little bit about your childhood and how, when you came into certain situations, specifically ones that posed a danger, how you would approach them?
Okay, yeah. I feel like being a girl, I feel like I've always been more scared. Maybe it's the way my parents raised me, but like always been more scared, more careful of my surroundings and others. Like I feel like my brother, like I remember I used to live in Ethiopia, and my brother, he would like be like more open to like climbing like trees or like riding donkeys, and it's like I would always be scared. I would always be like, oh my god, like
He was just like putting himself in these
these dangerous situations, versus me is like I would be scared to like get near the animals because I wouldn't want them to like attack me or like be in these kind of situations. Or like at nighttime, if I'm scared, like I'll just be like, oh, my dad's here, so I'm okay. But I would never think like, oh, my mom's here, so I'm okay. Like
it's just the way that I guess we're wired as people and as human beings. And so how do you think that, how you approach situations like that have changed or have stayed the same when you, matured into an adult?
I feel like now maturing into an adult, I understand why the way I thought, because men are obviously stronger than us. Like they are the type to they could harm women. So it's more important for women to be more careful in life and in their surroundings, because you just never know what other people could be thinking or what other people could do to you. Versus I'm not saying men shouldn't be either, but I feel like they are like more not to be like weird or anything, but I think men are more alpha to women, because like they can harm women more. So like I feel like for men it's not that nerve wracking to be walking out into that.
And they act a lot on their impulses, whereas women are usually generally more conservative.
More think into things more before they do things, or think about the consequences of things. And it's just because for us, like I feel like for us it's just like there's more on the line. Like there's more, like a guy, for example, like if your parents, if you ask your parents, oh, can I go on a sleepover? Like, for your parents, like, they might have been able to be like, oh, yeah, it's okay. Not saying that it is okay, but, like, versus a girl, like, it's more things to think about because it's, like, more common for women to get
especially,
raped.
like,
Yeah.
she's more, people view women as more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I feel in adolescence, in childhood, and in adulthood, boys and men are allowed to get away with the things they're able to get away with because they're boys. They have this, public persona that's painted for them, right? That they're strong and they're able to take care of themselves. Oh, they're just being boys, you know? Like, oh, they're doing something dangerous. They're just boys, right? But if a girl was doing the same thing, she would be met with criticism, right? And that translates, like I said before, in childhood, in adolescence, and in adulthood. There's variations of it, but the general consensus kind of remains the same, that women are vulnerable and that men are not.
Yeah.
So now, with the knowledge that we've gained from the developmental model by Diana Kuhn, we can compare and contrast what we see in the bees to the actual method of critical thinking. So when we look at Audre Lorde's poem, The Bees, it's a rich text for pretty much exploring the aspects of critical thinking, right? So in the context of Diana Kuhn's A Developmental Model of Critical Thinking, the poem, it vividly captures interactions between children, adults, and the natural world, providing, some sort of nuanced ground for analyzing behavior, decision-making, and this is where we can see the development for critical thinking across different ages and different genders. So in The Bees, Lorde provides the scenario where the young boys, the adults, and the young girls, they all interact in the beehive, with the beehive in distinctive ways. So let's start with the young boys. The boys in the poem, they exhibit the curiosity and direct engagement with the environment, typical of what we see, in early stages of Diana Kuhn's model. This direct interaction with the bees, it's driven by, curiosity and, lack of forethought. And specifically, it's a lack of forethought about the consequences of their actions. So it kind of mirrors the early childhood or possibly like middle school, age childhood stages where thinking is concrete and actions are guided more by immediate sensory experiences rather than the abstract reasoning or consideration of the consequences. And so when we talk about the critical thinking aspect, we really specify that this reflects the initial stages of critical thinking development, where individuals learn through interaction, but may not fully anticipate outcomes or consider like broader perspectives. And the boys' actions kind of show how an emerging engagement with the world that's, you're trying to explore, and sometimes that exploration can result in recklessness, and it's lacking in the reflective judgment that comes with maturity, that comes with, building up years of experiences. And so that's pretty much the summation of how the boys are acting in this, poem. When we take a look at the adults and their decision to intervene and destroy the hive, we see that the adults' decision, it's presumably for safety reasons, and it demonstrates some form of decision-making that involves evaluating, the risk of the situation and taking some action. And this might align with Kuhn's later stages of critical thinking development, where the adults are capable of making decisions based on broader considerations, such as safety, and possibly reflecting on their own experiences and the norms of how to proceed in a situation that poses a danger to children under your supervision. And we can look at the critical aspect of their decision-making, and we see that, however, the destruction of the hive raises questions about the depth of the critical thinking applied, because did the adults consider an alternative, less destructive methods when attacking the beehive, addressing that whole situation? This scenario, it kind of illustrates both the strengths and the limits of adult critical thinking, and it highlights the importance of reflective reasoning and, the evaluation of multiple perspectives. And so, specifically, ecological considerations when we're talking about the bees. And that Kuhn's model, it suggests that matures in adulthood, but we see that because of, improper fed information to the adults, that they choose, a method that's also somewhat impulsive, like the young boys. But the young girls are, kind of like the highlight at the end of the poem because they show restraint. And that's like the most important aspect, in my opinion. The young girls, their choice to show restraint and not really directly engage with the bees, it might indicate a different, perhaps more reflective approach to interacting with the natural world. And this could reflect middle childhood or early adolescence in Kuhn's model because, as we know, girls typically mature faster than boys in terms of physically and mentally, or in terms of physical and mental capabilities, right? And where it's where individuals kind of begin to realize different perspectives and perhaps anticipate the consequences of their actions more fully than younger boys would in this situation. And, the critical aspect of thinking when we're talking about the girls specifically, it's the girls' behavior. It somewhat exemplifies the critical thinking pathway that involves observation, consideration of potential outcomes, and a decision to refrain from intervening directly but voicing their opinions after. This demonstrates, early forms of risk assessment and decision making that's more cautious and potentially more reflective, indicating that the development of critical thinking skills that include foresight and empathy are really, really utilized when we're talking about the young girls. So overall, when we compare the bees to Kuhn's model, and it highlights how critical thinking can manifest in so many different ways, depending on the individual's developmental stage and the context of their actions. And the context of their actions is very, very vital because, one event can trigger another. The poem, it encapsulates the spectrum of critical thinking skills from the exploratory and concrete reasoning of childhood to the more abstract, the more evaluative, and sometimes flawed decision makings of adulthood, as well as nuanced reflective judgment that can emerge even in later stages of development. And we see that gradual shift as we progress through the poem. So this analysis kind of underscores the complexity of critical thinking as developmental processes are influenced by individual experiences, social context, and inherent, cognitive growth. So collectively, as we've analyzed this poem, we've seen the different methods of thinking and critical thinking specifically that can happen in different bodies. So the young boys, we took a deep look into that, and so how their impulsivity and natural curiosity leads them to do what they did in throwing the stones at the beehive. They didn't really consider the consequences, which was very, very important, but more than anything, they got adults involved in the situation when the young boy was stung. Without giving them full knowledge, the adults also acted impulsively while doing it for different reasons. The boys were just doing it just to be young boys, just playing around and, getting into trouble. The adults do it for the needs and safety of the children that they're supervising. But we still see that sort of impulsivity. But when we transition to the girls' method of thinking, who, witness the whole scenario, they show restraint and they're confused why the situation was even necessary to begin with. Why what happened, and, the fact that it wasn't necessary. And so they question why the boys got involved in the first place. And that's where we see their sort of restraint and their critical thinking as, even though they're the same age as those boys, we see it's developed far more. And so that's just kind of the things that I wanted to highlight in this analyzation. And I hope that, I provided good context in doing so. But thank you so much for listening. I really, really enjoyed taking, an introspective deep dive into this poem and all that came with it. So thank you so much for listening. My name is Ryan, and have a good day.